Welcome back, everyone. This is Ayad Boudiab, and we are proceeding with our AngularJS course. As you've seen with the videos that we have discussed so far, we know we downloaded Angular, we looked at applying filters, using controllers, data binding. We discussed all those features as we go through the course. But as you will see me going through the rest of the material, I'll be just going back and forth, trying to repeat some concepts and add to them as we go. That way we can be more familiar with the concept we're talking about. So for example, we already seen directives, we've seen the binding, but I'd like to talk more about it and see, look at it from different angles, different examples, illustrate more, use more directives that you have not seen. So that way you can be more familiar with it, especially that directives are a core part of Angular. So understanding them would be extremely important to be familiar and productive with Angular. So what are we going to do today? I'm going to look through an example. I'm going to create a module, of course, with a controller that contains some books and the book names, page count, things like that. And then I'm going to work with two-way data binding and see how we can work with that, just to illustrate the concept and be more familiar with it. For example, we will use the bind template, the non-bindable, and see how these can apply. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the top portion here. We have an empty page, and this title is about working with directives. Okay, now of course on the top I need to make sure that I include my reference to Angular. As you've seen from previous exercises, I have Angular downloaded and it's a part of my scripts folder, right? Two options I have here. I can refer to a CDN or a content delivery network, means Angular is somewhere out there on a server. I can reference it on my page, or I can download Angular and use it from my current location, which is I did in this case. I put it in the scripts folder, which means right now under 14 directive-1.html, in the same folder where this file is, I have a scripts folder, and then inside the scripts folder I have angular.js. Okay, so I have a reference to it. Now the second thing that I can work with is Bootstrap. You've seen me working with Bootstrap before. Bootstrap is important because we have, if we can take HTML5 and then add Bootstrap to it and AngularJS, then we have a really good foundation to build a web application. Because a lot of those features that I need, a lot of those CSS classes that I need exist within Bootstrap. That's why we can use Bootstrap. Again, I need to make sure here that we don't say that a Bootstrap is something that you have to have in order to work with Angular. No, but it's something interesting to have, to be able to work hand in hand with Angular, to be able to provide really good looking applications. Okay, so I need to reference Bootstrap. I need to reference Bootstrap theme, and then these also were downloaded to my local machine. So I went to the getbootstrap.com website, and then I downloaded Bootstrap, and then from there I created a styles folder, and then from the styles within the styles folder I put my CSS files. So for now these are under the styles folder and they look like this. I have bootstrap min.css and bootstrap theme min.css. These would be used within my page. They are both under the styles folder where the directives1 HTML file is. They are min because this is minified version, so it's smaller in size, easier to download and work with when the page loads, right? But if you need to debug your code, you don't have to use the min. You can remove that and reference the full version of Bootstrap, so you can step through your code. So I have my references, I have my links, because of course these are CSS pages, so I have my links in there. And now this is where the core part is. I need to create my script with all the Angular code that I'm interested in. Okay. Anytime I start with Angular, I need to create a module, right? So Angular dot module, and what's the name of that module, right? I need to give it a name, and let's call it directive, because since we're working with directive example, and normally we would like to tag the app to it. So directive app, you could have different names, different approach, different standard for naming these, but you can tag the module with the name plus app, and you can work with the controller by using a name plus the controller word attached to it. Sometimes you see it as a full controller spelled out, sometimes the CTRL that the some developers would like to use. So as long as you stick with a standard, then that's good. But in this case, I'm going to name it directive app, and then I need to put the dependency in here on what these modules depend on, and it's an empty array because it does not depend on anything. All right, now before I forget, and normally this is a good point in here for you to remember, don't forget to go to the HTML and put your ng app in there, because sometimes you just go on with your code, type everything, you forget the HTML tag, and you say, well, it's not loading, something's not working, right? So when you create your module, make sure you put, since now you know the name of the module, make sure you put the ng app up here, and then of course this would be the name of the app, which is the directive app that you saw over here. So now I have ng app equal the directive app. All right, I can stop in here, and then I can give this one a name. So I can give it a var my module equal angular.module, right? You've seen me doing this before. But also another feature that I can use is that Angular will allow you to chain your commands. Okay, so you can use something dot something dot something dot something, because this call in here will give me the module. I have the module. I can simply say dot controller. So I don't have to store in a variable and then ask the variable to build the controller. I can keep going and I say dot controller, and then let's give a name to that controller. Let's call it basic controller. Okay, and that controller will be using a function that depends on the $scope. And now I can put the body here, but make sure that my parentheses close and they match. Okay, so now I created my controller, and then I don't need the parenthesis, by the way, here. Now I have a match, right? So I have basic controller with the function scope. Now I can add something to the scope, right? I can go over here and start adding things to the scope. So in this case, I need a list of books. So I can ask scope dot books. That's what I'm adding to the scope, and makes it available. When I use the controller later, I'll be able to reference the books equal, and since it's an array, I'm going to use these square brackets for the array. Okay, now every one of those books have a name, page count, and a property whether it's read. So it's true or false. Did I read the book or not? Okay, so name, page count, and read. Let me give you that list so we don't have to go and type in it one at a time. Here's the list. I have 5 names in here. This is the list of the books with their page count and whether each book is read or not. This is my array named books. The books has been added to the scope. That's part of that controller, right? So now I should be able to use that book or books whenever I refer to my controller. Okay, so far so good. Let's continue down here and go inside the body and start working with some elements. I will have a div. Okay, and now in here I'm going to give that div an ID. Let's call this one book panel. All right, let's give it a class. Now where's that class coming from? this class is coming from Bootstrap. It's a panel, right? And then I'm going to use my ng controller here. So I'm referring to my controller so I can use it within the div, which means that the controller that I'm going to give here will be part of the scope for that div. Anything I put within the div can use that ng controller, right? And in this case, the ng controller is the basic controller that I stated earlier. Okay, so now the structure is good. Let's go ahead and save. And in here, let's put an h3 and give it a class that will make it the actual panel header, because that's what it is, right? It's a header, panel dash header. By the way, if you're not familiar with those CSS classes, I don't want you to be interrupted with the concept of Angular, so you can always go to the getbootstrap.com website and look at every one of those classes and see how it can be used. Okay, so we're using them to make things look pretty, but overall I don't really need them to get my Angular example to work. Okay, so now I have the basic controller, I have the class for the panel header, and let's name this one my books list. Save that. And then in Google Chrome, I'm going to load that page, right? So I'm going to copy the full path, come back to Google, paste it, enter, and it says my books list. Well, right now, I don't have anything in there, right? So we'll proceed to see what else I want to add. But looks like it's a panel, and then I have a title attached to it. And let's see what else we can do with the rest of the code here. All right, so I have my h3, and then I have that within my div. All right, now let's continue. I need two-way binding. I need to explain the two-way binding, one-way binding, and unbindable, like I promised you at the beginning. Okay, so two-way binding, we've seen this before, right? I need to list the number of books that I have right now in my books list. Okay, so I'm going to create a div here, and in that div I'm going to say there are some books in my list, right? And that's the one we normally use. I will show you how that works. So we can say there are, normally we need to say 5 books in my list, right? Okay, now this is static. I want to refer to the array that I see up there and then refer to the elements that exist in it, right? So instead of the 5, I'm going to take that off and I'm going to use the double curly braces. And that's how we do two-way binding, right? So now within the basic controller, what do I have? In the basic controller, I have books. I can say books, which is the books from up there, but books is an array. And remember what JavaScript does? It has the length property. So tell me how many elements I have. So there are books.length books in my list. Well, bring in the browser, reload. There are books.length books in my list. So it's not displaying properly, right? Something is not right in here. It should be able to give me the number of elements in the list. Let's go back in here and see what's going on. You can easily tell I have in here basic controller. Here basic controller. I missed one L, right? So that's controller. Now it knows what the controller is. Come back to the page, reload, and now it says there are 5 books in my list. Okay, so I know that I can use the two-way data binding to be able to tell what I have within my controller. Okay, let's continue and see what else we can do, because you've seen this before. I've discussed this before with you in previous video. So let's go with another div in this case. And in here, I'm going to use a different approach. I'm going to say there are, and then books in my list. But I need to use the same approach. I need to know how many books I have. I could introduce a span in here. And then in the span, instead of using the two-way binding that you saw up there, I can use in here one-way binding, because I'll explain for you the difference later, but all what I need is to bind to that list and give me the n number of elements, right? So I don't have to have two-way binding. I can use the ng bind, which is the one-way binding, and then I make ng bind equal, and then books dot length. Okay, so I did use ng bind instead of the two-way binding that I saw up there. If I reload my page, it says there are 5 books in my list because it does the same thing, right? This is the second one that you saw over here. All right, let's continue, see what else we can use. How about the non-bindable one? Okay, let's look at the non-bindable approach. Now I have another div. It says there are books.length books in my list. I'm using books.length. Okay, like I did use books.length up here. But in this case, I use the directive non-bindable, which is pretty much clear, tells me that it should not bind to it. It shouldn't work with that element in here. Now, why do I do this? In some situations, you have different JavaScript libraries working together, and they could be using these double curly brackets that Angular use. So you need to kind of turn off the Angular approach, and you need to use what the other library is working with. So you say, this div, I don't want you to bind to anything. In other words, this one should not print 5 books in the list, right? So let's come back to the browser and reload it. And sure enough, it says there are books length books in my list, because it didn't bind to this. It just give it to me as is. Okay. All right. Now one more. In some situations, you need a specific template, right? So I need to say bunch of elements that I'm working with. So let's go ahead and introduce a div and the closing one. Now I need to use the bind template. So I can say within the div, I can say ng bind dash template equals, and here where I introduce my template. Now what would that template do? Let's say I have not read. Now I need to introduce the first book and the last book. I need to give them by names, right? I have not read, curly braces, close. That should be an element in here. I can say books sub 0, which should be the first one. I have not read this one, right? It says false up here. So I have not read books sub 0. That would be the first one. Dot name, right? And then outside the braces, look, it's like I'm building a template, right? Nor introduce the braces again. And in this case, I would say books sub 4, which is the 5th element in the list, dot name. So let's bring the browser, reload. I have not read JavaScript Made Easy nor ASP.NET 5, MVC 5. Okay, so this using the actual template that I was talking about. So as you can see, in this exercise, I introduce you to the basic controller, or just I named it basic controller. I can name anything, but the concept of a controller, we've seen this before. Just this is a refresh on how things would work. And then I introduce you to the different ways of doing binding. We worked with different ways of doing the binding, right? Two-way data binding with the books.length. I also showed you how we can work with a one-way binding with the ng bind. I introduced you to the way of saying I don't want this to bind by the ng non-bindable property, and then in here I'm using the ng bind template directive. So these are the different ways I can use the different directives within AngularJS. I'm going to spend more videos on discussing those directives because again they are the core portion of AngularJS. So please stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Ayad Boudiab, and you take